This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market.
One of the things that we history buffs like to talk about are turning points in history. One of those moments that swung on the edge of a knife when a simple change, a general makes a different decision, or a shift in luck might have changed vast swaths of history. One of those might have occurred on this date, August 1st, in 1798, when the French warship L'Orient exploded and sealed the fate of Europe. It's history that deserves to be remembered. Just looking at my monthly progress report from Incogni with all the new data removal requests that occurred in June, I tell you what, those data pirates, they never give up. Thank you, Incogni, for sponsoring this episode of The History Guy. Go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy, use the code TheHistoryGuy, get your exclusive offer of 60% off.
Thousands of shady organizations are collecting, aggregating, and trading your personal data, and that can lead to everything from spam emails to identity theft and a ruined credit rating. I get notices very frequently saying how some of my data was lost and the almost constant data breaches that occur these days. I know that my data is always at risk.
Now, you can try to do this yourself. You have the right to ask these data brokers to take down your data, but it's going to take you years to try to do it. And the thing is, new ones are popping up all the time.
So Incogni does the hard part for you automatically. Incogni helps you protect your privacy, take your personal data off the market by reaching out to those data brokers on your behalf and requesting your personal data removal and dealing with their objections. And the best part is Incogni continues to address threats as they arise. And since I signed up with Incogni in September of 2023, they've saved me more than 477 hours of work that it would have taken for me to try to do the more than 700 removal requests. And Incogni has added new unlimited and family unlimited plans as well, making it even a better deal. It also has added the very cool custom removals feature, which allows you to point to any people search site or other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you.
So give the data pirates a poke in the eye and give yourself some peace of mind, and go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code TheHistoryGuy to get your exclusive offer of 60% off. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy and the code TheHistoryGuy to get 60% off. You'll be glad you did.
The French ship of the line Dauphin Royal was launched in July of 1791 in the midst of the French Revolution. Dauphin Royal was an ocean-class ship, one of 15 to eventually be completed. These were massive three-deck ships of the line, mounting 118 guns. At over 5,000 tons displacement, the ships of the ocean class were among the largest and most powerful warships built in their day, larger than British first-rate ships of the line. While Dauphin means dolphin, the name wasn't about the marine mammal. Since 1350, the heir apparent to the French crown was called the Dauphin, a legacy of a dolphin depicted on a coat of arms. The Dauphin Royal was named in honor of Louis Charles, heir to King Louis XVI, a king that had become quite unpopular before the ship could even be commissioned. In 1792, the Dauphin of France was imprisoned, and the ship was renamed for the Revolution and called the Sans-Culottes, meaning, oddly, without pants. The sans-culottes were the French common people that supported the Revolution and were known for wearing common pantaloons rather than the fashionable fancy silk knee breeches of the aristocrats. The ship played a brief part in the March 1795 Battle of Genoa against the combined British Neapolitan fleet. By 1798, the government had shifted again. The so-called Directory was in charge, and France was at war. In May of 1798, the ship was renamed one more time by the greatest French general of that war. On the eve of a grand campaign, Napoleon Bonaparte renamed the ship L'Orient, the Orient. The name had a specific meaning. While today the Orient refers to the Far East, originally the term meant essentially simply east of Europe. It was in fact a common name for Egypt. While the destination of the fleet and the name of the ship were a closely held secret, Napoleon had a daring plan, and the ship L'Orient, the flagship of Vice Admiral Francois-Paul Brouillet d'Aguillet, commander-in-chief of the 15 ships of the line of the invasion fleet, was a significant part of that plan. Napoleon was either unaware or unconcerned by the long-held superstition that it is unlucky to rename a ship. While France, largely owing to Napoleon himself, had defeated Britain's allies in the War of the First Coalition, France was still at war with Britain. The French naval defeats the previous year had underlaid British dominance in the English Channel. The Royal Navy, it seems, prevented a direct invasion of the British Isles. Napoleon looked for another way to diminish his adversary. Egypt was, he reasoned, vulnerable. There were many factors in the decision, some having to do with the politics of the Ottoman Empire, of which Egypt was a part. But Napoleon's real goal, aside from the value of plunder, was to establish a French colony astride British supply lines with its imperial holding in India. Not only might a French conquest of Egypt disrupt trade, but it might serve as a base to invade British India itself. Egypt's rulers, the Mamelukes, were considered backwards by European standards, and the country ripe for the picking. Moreover, when Britain had lost its allies at the end of the war, they had lost their bases in the Mediterranean, severely weakening the power and reach of the Royal Navy there. Still, Napoleon, despite having a strong fleet, didn't want to meet the Royal Navy in battle while his ships were carrying the 40,000 some soldiers of his invasion force. While the presence of his fleet could not be kept secret, the destination could. So long as the fleet sent to find him didn't know where to look, he could deliver his army unmolested. Naval historian David Cordingly wrote in 2003 that Naples and Sicily were thought to be the most likely targets, leaving the British fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson, far behind. After capturing the island of Malta and looting the treasury of the Knights of Malta, the subject of another episode of the History Guy, Napoleon headed for Egypt. The naval campaign was interesting. More than once Nelson came close to the French fleet, but he had lost his frigates in storms and so had limited scouting ability. He even sussed out that Napoleon was headed for Egypt, but not knowing their disposition, he arrived ahead of the French, and finding nothing there, searched elsewhere. What if Nelson had encountered Napoleon in the Mediterranean, where his fleet of hundreds of transports was vulnerable? Could Nelson have caused a disaster that put an end to the ambitious general's career? Maybe not. Foreign policy writer Derek Davidson noted on the website Foreign Exchanges, Nelson's plan, had he caught up to the French, called for sending part of his fleet to chase the French troop transports, leaving the rest of his ships to be outnumbered by the French ships of the line. Obviously, we'll never know, but this is probably a very bad plan. In other words, it's quite possible that had Nelson actually caught up with the French at sea, he would have lost the ensuing battle. It is obviously not a certain outcome. The French fleet was hampered carrying troops and supplies, and their sailors inexperienced in battle. But was Bonaparte saved because a squall had scattered Nelson's frigates, leaving him with limited scouting ability? Was the course of history changed by a storm at sea? But history is history. Napoleon landed his troops and won a quick and decisive victory against the surprised Mamelukes of the Ottoman Empire on July 21st. Oddly called the Battle of the Pyramids, even though it was fought some 9 miles away from the nearest pyramid. It was an auspicious start. Meanwhile, Brouillet's fleet was in a bay called Aboukir. The harbor in Alexandria proved too shallow for his largest ships, and Aboukir was the closest place to anchor. Napoleon had authorized Brouillet to sail to the Greek island of Corfu, but he had chosen to stay, presumably to guard the French army and secure the invasion. But his fleet was also in disrepair and his men inexperienced, and he may have thought that anchoring in a defensive position in a bay where he would be protected from the land side would be his best chance if Nelson's fleet arrived. If Brouillet had left for Corfu, might his fleet have been saved or been able to engage the British under more favorable conditions? Might Napoleon's invasion of Egypt had a greater chance if the fleet remained, able to provide supply and carry reinforcements? In any case, Brouillet decided to make his stand at Aboukir Bay. Were his preparations sufficient? In a letter he dismissed the British fleet, saying, "My opinion is that they have not so many as 14 sail of the line, and not being superior in number, have not thought fit to try conclusions with us." He was, of course, wrong. Not only was Nelson ready to attack, but he was willing to do so in an unconventional way. When Nelson finally arrived on August 1st, Accordingly writes, there was also the matter of timing. When the French fleet were first sighted, Nelson's squadron was some 9 miles away. With the moderate northerly breeze, his 74-gun ships of the line could only travel around 5 knots, and it would therefore take the leading ships nearly 2 hours to reach the enemy. By the time the trailing ships reached the bay, the sun would be setting, and much of the battle would have to be fought in the dark. Apart from the obvious dangers of navigating in unknown waters in bad light, there was the hazard of mistaking one's own ships for the enemy on a night action. When the French Admiral de Brouillet was told that the British fleet had been sighted, he certainly assumed that they would wait till the next morning before attacking. But Nelson, who knew he had a wind advantage that might not persist in the morning, attacked anyway. Cooper Williams, a minister aboard the 74-gun HMS Swiftsure, wrote, "Here the heroism was displayed in the prompt decision of Admiral Nelson. When his squadron was well collected round him, he determined without loss of time to attack the foe. Formidable as their appearance was, superior their number, weight of metal, and size, night coming on, and an unknown navigation. Surely too much cannot be said of such magnanimity. His honor, character, and life were be put to the decision of the enterprise, and the fleet was with him. Williams wrote, "Towards them we flood with the enthusiastic ardor of men bent on conquest, and who knew there could be no alternative between that and death." Bouillet had made many mistakes in preparation, but the worst was that, given the plan to use the shore to defend one side of his ships, he had anchored too far away, and the British ships were still able to slip in along the shore side and catch his ships in a crossfire. Still, he outgunned Nelson's 74-gun ships of the line, one of which, HMS Culloden, had grounded near to shore, a victim of the poor knowledge of the harbor. Nelson had been brilliant, attacking the French van, knowing that the wind would prevent his rear from moving to support them, allowing an advantage. Still, the massive 120-gun Lorient flagship of the Admiral dwarfed Nelson's 74s, and Lorient had an advantage. Captain Darby, commanding the 74-gun HMS Bellerophon, was apparently attempting to anchor on Lorient's quarter, limiting its field of fire. But in the dark, accordingly writes, either the anchor was dragging on the seabed or the sailors failed to check the cable and let out too much. When the anchor finally brought the ship to halt, she found herself not at the bows of the enormous flagship, but exactly alongside her, facing the entire weight of her broadside guns. Despite concerns over the crew, Lorient was well prepared and well commanded. Accordingly describes the action aboard the Bellerophon. The scene below deck was like something from Dante's Inferno, a low, confined space, sweltering hot and filled with acrid smoke, deafening explosions and toiling, sweating bodies. Lorient had the advantage of a third deck. Accordingly explains, every time she fired her upper deck, she wreaked more havoc on the Bellerophon. While the rest of the fleet was maneuvering, Bellerophon was alone alongside Lorient for more than an hour. The ship's boats were smashed, many guns dismounted, and the masts slowly battered. Fire from French marines in the rigging of Lorient was taking out the officers. Hit in the head, Captain Darby was knocked unconscious. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Daniel, was killed. The second lieutenant, Lander, wounded. The fourth and fifth lieutenants were killed. Then the mainmast was shot away, and as it fell to deck, it killed Lander. The third lieutenant, Cathcart, was commanding the ship. Under the battering HMS Alexander, a 74, finally reached the line and, accordingly writes, was able to fire into the vulnerable stern of Lorient. Bellerophon was a wreck, nearly dismasted and unable to maneuver, but Lorient was on fire. Williams writes, at 3 minutes past 9 o'clock, a fire was observed to have broken out in the cabin of Lorient, to the point Captain Hollowell of Swiftsure ordered as many guns as could be spared from firing on the French ship Franklin to be directed, and at the time that Captain Allen of Marines should throw in the whole fire of his musketry into the enemy's quarter, while the Alexander on the other side was keeping up an incessant shower of shot to the same point. Historian Christopher Lloyd wrote in his 1973 book, The Nile Campaign, Lorient had nearly demolished two of our 74-gun ships, namely Bellerophon and Majestic, and would, no doubt, have done much more serious mischief. But fortunately, they had been painting the ship, and with true French carelessness, had left the paint oil jars on the middle deck. There had been more than one accidental fire of small consequence, but now the oil running into it blazed up more furiously. Williams wrote, the conflagration now began to rage with dreadful fury. Still the French admiral sustained the honor of his flag with heroic firmness, but at length a period was put to his exertions by a cannonball, which cut him asunder. He had before received 3 desperate wounds, 1 on the head, 2 in his body, but could not be prevailed upon to quit his station. His captain, Cafabianca, fell by his side. Several of the officers and men, feeling the impracticability of extinguishing the fire, which had now extended itself along the upper decks and was flaming up the masts, jumping overboard, some supporting themselves on spars and pieces of wreck, others swimming with all their might to escape the dreaded catastrophe. Bellerophon, entangled with Lorient, realized the danger of the burning ship. She tried to disengage, but her foremast collapsed. They tried to use the spritsail, the small sail on the bowsprit, to get some ability to maneuver, but she drifted free. That almost caused its own disaster. Nelson had ordered his ships to display lights from their masts to show their fellows that they were British. But Bellerophon had no masts. Williams writes, when Captain Hollowell of Swiftsure perceived a ship standing out of action, having no lights displayed, supposing that he was an enemy, he felt inclined to fire into her. But as that would have broken the plan he had laid down for his conduct, he desisted, and happy it was that he did too, for afterwards we found the ship in question was the Bellerophon. A French witness on shore wrote a letter that was intercepted and published in the Times of London. The cannonade was very heavy until about 9:15 o'clock, when, favored by the night, we perceived an immense light which announced to us that some ship was on fire. At this time the thunder of cannon was heard with redoubled fury, and at 10 o'clock the ship on fire blew up with the most dreadful explosion. Williams writes, the fire communicated to the magazine, and L'Orient blew up with a crashing sound that deafened all around her. The tremulous motion, felt to the very bottom of each ship, was like that of an earthquake. The fragments were driven such a vast height into the air that some moments elapsed before they could descend, and then the greater apprehension was formed from the volumes of burning matter which threatened to fall on the decks and rigging of the surrounding ships. An awful silence reigned for several minutes, as if the contending squadrons, struck with horror at the dreadful event, which in an instant had hurled so many brave men into the air, had forgotten their hostile rage in pity for the sufferers. It was a desperate battle. Nelson, aboard HMS Vanguard, took a wound to the forehead so bad that he thought it mortal, telling his flag captain, "I am killed. Remember me to my wife." Corinne Huguenot, of the Napoleon Foundation in Paris, sums up the effect of the loss of L'Orient. The explosion of the French flagship, L'Orient, at about 10 p.m. sealed the French defeat, long before the fighting ceased. The French fleet was devastated in the battle. Of 13 ships of the line, 9 eventually struck their colors and were captured. L'Orient destroyed, and another ship of the line scuttled. French naval power in the Mediterranean was broken. Underwater archaeology of the wreck of L'Orient in 1998 determined that instead of one explosion, as has been thought, the great ship was the victim of 2 nearly simultaneous explosions, in both the main powder magazine at the stern and the auxiliary magazine at the bow. It's unclear exactly how many of the ship's crew of around 1,000 perished in the explosion. Accounts differ, but the British reported only rescuing 70 survivors. The British victory at what came to be called the Battle of the Nile, though it was not fought in the Nile but near its mouth, was significant. Historian Harold Mark explains in the online World History Encyclopedia, the British victory had profound consequences for the continuation of the French Revolutionary Wars. Prior to the battle, Great Britain had been fighting revolutionary France alone, but Nelson's victory helped convince other European powers to join against France in the War of the Second Coalition. By destroying the French fleet, Nelson also cut Bonaparte and his army off from Europe, contributing to the eventual failure of Napoleon's campaign in Egypt and Syria. Although the Battle of the Nile remains less famous than the later Battle of Trafalgar, it arguably played an even larger role in the annihilation of French naval power, which allowed for British century-long domination of the seas. For this reason, it has been called the most decisive naval engagement of the Great Age of Sail.
Nelson, of course, survived, only to be killed at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. Bellerophon also survived, not just to fight at the Battle of Trafalgar, but when Napoleon was finally defeated after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, he surrendered to the British aboard HMS Bellerophon. The loss of L'Orient was the result of many strategic errors, but the ship fought bravely. Its explosion was a decisive moment in a decisive battle. Had the great ship survived to fight on, had Nelson's gambit failed, then the trajectory of 2 of the most important names of the Napoleonic Wars, Nelson and Napoleon, might have been different. Napoleon might have succeeded in Egypt and Syria, might have cut off Britain from her empire and her allies, might have won the Napoleonic Wars. The implications are vast. The map of Europe would be different. Perhaps it would have been a disaster for the people of Europe, or perhaps it would have created a unity of purpose that would have prevented the wars to come. But L'Orient did explode. A moment so dramatic that even those fighting the battle appreciated it and stopped to watch it happen. One moment, and history, as they say, is history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.